Καλησπέρα σας. Σας καλωσορίζω στην απόψινή δημόσια τηλεδιάλεξη του Μεταπτυχιακού Προγράμματος ΠΝΥΚΑ, Πολιτική Ιστορία, Θεωρία και Πράξη του Ανοικτού Πανεπιστημίου Κύπρου, η οποία διεξάγεται στο πλαίσιο του προγράμματος Erasmus Plus του Πανεπιστημίου μας και έχει ως προσκεκλημένη αυτή την εβδομάδα μία εξαιρετική καθηγήτρια από την Γεωργία, την Δρ Nino Tabeshadze, και ευθύς αμέσως θα αλλάξω και εγώ τη γλώσσα, διότι η απόψινή μας τηλεδιάλεξη, όπως και γενικά όλες οι τηλεδιαλέξεις που θα πραγματοποιήσει αυτή την εβδομάδα η κυρία Tabeshadze, θα πραγματοποιηθούν στην αγγλική γλώσσα. Έτσι λοιπόν, στο σημείο αυτό θα παρουσιάσω το βιογραφικό της ομιλήτριάς μας στην αγγλική γλώσσα. Θα ήθελα να σας ευχαριστήσω για την τηλεπαρουσία σας και να υπενθυμίσω ότι, όπως και σε όλες τις δημόσιες τηλεδιαλέξεις του Ανοικτού Πανεπιστημίου Κύπρου, έτσι και σε αυτή την περίπτωση η διάλεξη βιντεοσκοπείται και θα είναι διαθέσιμη σύντομα για εκ των υστέρων παρακολούθηση. Έτσι λοιπόν, τώρα θα μου επιτρέψετε να αλλάξω την γλώσσα, να παρουσιάσω το βιογραφικό της απόψινής μας ομιλήτριας στην αγγλική γλώσσα και ευθύς αμέσως θα της δώσω τον λόγο για να πραγματοποιήσει την ομιλία της για το πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρον θέμα Impact of Cross-Cultural Communication on International Relations. Dr. Nino Tabeshadze holds a PhD in Culture Studies, focusing on interdisciplinary research, collective trauma and coping mechanisms. She is professor in the School of Social Sciences at Georgian Institute of Public Affairs. Since 2013, she is also invited professor at the Ivane Zavachisvili Tbilisi State University at the Faculty of the Social and Political Sciences. She is a honorable member of the World Museum representing Georgia, and she was a nominee of the Chinandali Award 2018 in the category of Best Young Scholar of the Year. Dr. Tabeshadze is going to speak us tonight about the impact of cross-cultural communication on international relations, and I would like to give her the floor for her lecture.
Hey, hello. Good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where are you right now looking at us from. My name is Nino, as already mentioned, and today we will be talking a little bit about understanding the global dialogue, or otherwise the impact of cross-cultural communication on international relations. First of all, let me say that I'm very happy to be here and enjoy the hospitality of your beautiful university and hospitality of your good professors. So we start from introduction, and why is it important at all? Oftentimes people have a question, and maybe you also have a question, of why should I know anything about intercultural relations? Why is it so important to understand what intercultural communications is about? Well, simply as that, you all might have international friends or international surroundings. You might go for studies in other countries abroad, or otherwise you might be invited to work abroad. Of course, if you are not effective in having good cross-cultural communication or some of the skills, it might be very hard to adopt to the environment that you're going to meet abroad, or to the people who are from different communities visiting you for different purposes. So, of course, more accent today will be on politics. So examples that we are going to discuss mostly will consider the examples from the politics, as long as we are talking about international relations. However, this does not mean that we don't have to think of cross-cultural communication in our immediate environment, such as communication with international staff, for example, at the university, or maybe among your friends who are not exactly of the same derivation, right? So we start here with the introduction, and we are going to talk about understanding and how the understanding of cross-cultural interaction is very important in order to shape some type of the global interaction process. So first of all, we say that in order to say what cross-cultural communication is, we need to understand that cross-culturality means that you have shared or maybe understood other people's values or their belief systems and their norms from the diverse cultures. To the very basic level, I can give you my personal example, for instance, of the culture shock, or maybe you have experienced already culture shock. So when you enter from one community or society to another, and you might meet the situation, for instance, in which people use less body language, so they are most prone to use only mimicry on the face or facial expressions, and you start to wave your hands like crazy because this is your culture where you come from, where you are used to using a lot of gesticulation. The representatives of the other culture might be slightly taken aback, and they might think that you are either not serious, or you don't understand them, or you don't know some type of the politeness rule. The same is said, for instance, about the cultures that have a very big respect towards the silence, whereas there are the other cultures that require you to be more active listeners by using some of the words. For instance, when you are listening to the person, right? I don't know how is it in your cultures, but in my culture, in Georgia, you need to engage. You need to say, yes, okay, I understand. Oh, what do you say? But at the same time, in the other cultures, such as, for instance, Scandinavian cultures, if you interrupt the person while they are saying something and you try to be empathetic too much, it can actually create the opposite effect. Therefore, we say that in order to have effective cross-cultural communication, you need to grasp the behaviors, values, norms of those people who you meet on the diverse basis before and during the interaction process. Well, you might also ask, why is it important nowadays? So it was always important and people did not talk about this, or what is happening? And the problem is that in Middle Ages, as well as in early 18th century, in early 19th century, right, until basically maybe even mid 20th century, people were not so communicative, not so active in communication, because today, again, we would say today we live in the globalized world. As we remember, globalization as the concept belongs to the 20th century. That's a 20th century phenomenon. And it is connected to the migration, workforce migration, study migration, etc. Therefore, when we talk about the cross-cultural communication, the first need for that appeared thanks to the globalized world. Therefore, we also can assume that cross-cultural communication plays a crucial role in order to foster the understanding. Understanding leads to cooperation. You will never want to cooperate with the person who you don't understand, because you might not trust them. You might believe that this person is not exactly speaking your language or understanding you, right? So you don't want to do the common project maybe with such a person, or write any type of, I don't know, article or literature work with them. So you would rather stay in your comfort zone and do the work with the person who understands you linguistically or personally, on the personal level, of course. So cooperation and understanding leads to final harmonious coexistence among people from various cultural backgrounds. I think that there are several countries in the world that actually have a very strong drive to understand this, and I think that Cyprus should be one of them, because as far as I saw from my couple of days experience of being here, the society is incredibly multicultural. So in order to exist and coexist in multicultural societies, there needs to be mutual respect. And for mutual respect, you need to understand, where do the other people's traditions or where do their positions stem from. Therefore, we say that in some of the cases, cross-cultural communication is the guarantee of the peaceful coexistence between different communities or different ethnic groups inside one state. Some of the key reasons, other key reasons, apart from the fact that you want to have maybe good relations with your neighbors and with your friends who are not of the same ethnic group, Some of the other key reasons for studying cross-cultural communication or for being interested in it is also to have trade and commerce. So I don't know, maybe some of you are aiming at the startup, or maybe some of you are in business and you want to continue working for the business, or maybe employment further on, or maybe you want to be self-employed. In any case, employment and trade, business and trade, is very much dependent on cross-cultural communications. This is not a new area for intercultural or cross-cultural communications, because if you remember, from the Middle Ages, the establishment of the cities in Europe was actually based on the trade and commerce. So the farmers would bring to the cities the products that they grew and they had supply of, and they would sell those products, right? So for that, they needed communication. Therefore, the first communication and cross-cultural communication in cases when the products were sold in the other countries was especially vital. I would remember here the example of, for example, cross-Mediterranean Sea trade of Egypt, or similarly cross-Mediterranean trade of Greece, as an example. Workforce diversity. So the more the world grows, the more workforce moves from one country to another, right? Classical example. So in that case, of course, cross-cultural understanding and communication is very important, because you need to understand that wherever you go, wherever you are a workforce, whichever country you might visit or you might be employed in, you still carry your own culture. You still carry your own understanding of the concepts that is not going to change regardless of where you're going to go or where you're going to work. However, at the same time, you need to somehow adjust and adapt to the environment where you are going. I would give you the typical example of maybe Singapore, even, where, for example, extreme nudity at the workplace might be punishable. So if you go there and, I don't know, if you wear ultra short crop top, which would not be a problem for your community, it might potentially be a problem for Singapore community, potentially again, right? So it depends on the rules and traditions of internal country. Education. And so when you go for getting the education in the other countries, or when international students visit your university or your immediate environment, you might appear in the situation when either you feel isolated or they feel isolated. We do have the concept of culture shock, which we are not touching today in depth because we do not have time for that, basically. But generally, it happens often that just because you meet a different culture or representatives of the other countries, you start to feel more isolated. You start to feel that you don't really understand each other. You don't comprehend each other's cultural patterns. Therefore, you might really assume that, okay, I don't want to be friends with this person who is like completely different from me. And I would rather sit alone, or I would sit in the back of the row or in the back of the auditorium, just listening and doing my own things. I don't know if you have ever asked yourself a question: why do people so eagerly try to search for diasporas in other countries? I don't know, maybe you have asked that question to yourself, but you know, it is a common practice that a lot of times when people try to get the idea of where they are and what they are doing, they then start to search for the diaspora of their own country, right? And this leads to, for example, there are, you know, this famous concept of Chinatowns. So those are the towns, like part of the city where the Chinese or Eastern population lives together very tightly. So why is it necessary? Is it the problem of adoption? Is it the problem of adaptation of the culture, or what is going on, right? Well, there can be doubt, or there can be, you know, asserted that people feel much more secure in the environment of the like-minded people. So in that sense, when you visit the other country and you feel isolated in your university or in your studying or educational place, you might also do the same. You might search the people who at least speak your language and share some cultural values that you have and the others don't, right? And the vice versa. You might now understand more people around you after, I hope after this lecture especially, that do not socialize that much, maybe because they are foreigners and they really don't understand your culture. So you have to know that this is not because they don't like you or their culture is less likable than yours, but rather it is because there is a cross-cultural competence that needs to be developed in receiver as well as in the person who enters the new community. Tourism and hospitality. And this is another very famous dimension for cross-cultural communication. So for instance, if you are a tourist in the country and you don't exactly know that looking into the eyes of the policeman is considered as a vulgar action, right? In this case, I'm talking about United Arab Emirates and the common stereotype or the, let's say, rule in the society that looking into the man's eye, especially when you're a female and you try to talk to them, it can be assessed as negative action. So in these cases, of course, you understand that whether you are a tourist or no, this still applies to you as well. So what is it that makes tourism and hospitality such a difficult field to work in? The fact that you need to understand more or less the requirements that are arisen by other cultural representatives in your immediate environment. For example, you can be a manager of the hotel, or you can have a hotel itself, and you would know that if, for example, one cultural representative might like loud parties, such as it can be, Georgians, for example, they like loud parties, right? We like loud parties in my nation. On the other hand, if in the neighboring room you besettled Scandinavian person who likes to have good night's sleep, to have the energy the next day. So those two might never be happy in each other's company. And you as a manager of the hotel might have a serious problem later on in dealing with those things. Therefore, the minimal cross-cultural competence is also required while managing tourism and hospitality business. Also, we say that, when you have a good competence in cross-cultural communications, it of course, naturally promotes inclusivity. You understand people. The moment when you get how people think, you start to include them in your psychological field or in your immediate physical field, or at least mentally, right? So you don't dismiss them anymore. For instance, if you know that the person is quiet when they are unhappy because they don't like to process their emotions with too many words, because in their culture silence is golden, such as, for example, Japanese. So they are not very much shouting if they don't like something, and you know that, and you have a group mate or a neighbor or your friend who is quiet and is from Japan. You might also start to understand that this person does not talk or shout so much when they don't like something because it is not part of their culture. Therefore, it is not accepted to, exhibit, this person will not be expected to exhibit the, let's say, ultra big gesticulation or, for example, crying or hysterical shouting, etc., if they dislike something. So expression of anger is very different from each culture, from culture to culture, right? There are cultures which tell you that you have to shout if you don't like something. There are other cultures which tell you that you have to keep calm, even if you dislike your immediate environment as well as the circumstances that you have. So understanding that naturally leads to having more inclusivity towards the people who are around you. Also, it reduces misunderstandings between the people. Oftentimes it is that, for example, while giving a feedback, it is a famous idea, a European idea, that you need to say and assert at first what was good, and then you have to say what was bad. Now, if you don't know this rule, right? If you are a student, for instance, and you don't know that this is the common practice among professors to at first tell you that, oh, but this was very good work. It was amazing work. But I would like to suggest, and then actual feedback comes with those words. So if you don't know that, and if you enter the room, and if the professor tells you, okay, this was a good work, but I have some suggestions, and then you believe that, okay, my work was fantastic, professor said it was really good, and then you receive middle mark, not very good, but not very bad either. And you might get confused, you might get pissed, you might start thinking, okay, but this person told me I was good. Well, the thing is, there is a feedback culture, right? So if you understand the feedback culture, so you understand that at first professor will outline the positives that most probably professor sees in your work, and then they start to give suggestions which are actually the most valuable feedback, right? Because that is the area for improvement. So if you know that this is the strategy, then you will not react in very painful way. Then you will understand, okay, my work was good, but this person feels that there are some things that I need to work on, right? So it's not that ideal. Whereas in the first case, the attitude would be, oh my God, if I was so good, why do I get a low mark, right? So for that, you need to, of course, know and understand what is behind that feedback motivation. Feedback is just one example here, but if you understand what is the cultural communicational pattern behind the actions, then you definitely will avoid a lot of misunderstandings. Teamwork enhancement. Of course, if you have a teammate who struggles, if you have a teammate who behaves not in the most expected way, right? You don't expect them to do that, but they do. For example, there are louder cultures who believe that if you scream louder, you are more correct, right? I'm sure you've seen that type of the communities where the people shout on each other, and they believe that more assertion, more usage of body language, shouting louder on someone makes their argument more valuable. So in that case, if you also understand that that is the type of the culture, so you don't need to overreact on that, of course it will enhance your productivity, and of course it will enhance the teamwork. After all, I would like to tell you that after many years of experience, my experience is that the more you have cross-cultural competence developed, the more you are ready to listen and respect the other people, the more they want to work with you. So it is a mutual process of respect. About the diplomacy. So in diplomacy and international relations, cross-cultural communication is vital because imagine that you are expected to build a diplomatic tie with the other countries, and of course other countries have other values, other countries have other language, and a lot of other things that you might need to consider, right? It is very vital for diplomats to go through cross-cultural communication course, and there are a couple of countries actually that pursue this exact purpose. So there are certain states in the world that actually educate their future diplomats. There are special diplomatic schools where future ambassadors study not only language of the country where they visit, but also traditions and cultural elements, communicational patterns, so that it will be easier for the diplomats, and it will be also easier for the people of the host country to accept them. Another, maybe another factor or the situation where the cross-cultural communication is vital, it is to resolve the conflicts. So conflicts happen a lot of times, right? Such as war or minor military conflicts or civil wars, etc. So conflicts can be of military kind, of non-military kind, of course, belligerent, non-belligerent, etc. But in order to resolve a conflict as a diplomat, you need to have a full understanding of the local culture. It often happens that the missioners or humanitarian missions that visit conflict areas, right, especially on the African continent, they need to learn the culture before they will actually start to give recommendations about the possible conflict resolution. Promoting peace and cooperation among nations. I know that sounds a little bit too utopic. You might say, oh my God, that sounds like a world peace. But actually, it is possible to promote general peace work because, again, cross-cultural communication is a competence, that is a skill that is based on the mutual understanding and respect. If you respect a person and they respect you back, then most probably there will be little reason to go in conflict, right? Because there will be no idea that you are better than someone else, or someone else will have no idea that they are better than you. They are older than you, they have more entitlement than you, etc. So the conflict root in itself on the psychological and cultural basis can be solved. And also, we can say that cross-cultural communication can be a bridge between nations, you know. A lot of times there can be the case when cross-cultural communication helps the hostile nations to find some commonalities between each other, or maybe to find an understanding of each other's history, or find that, for instance, I don't know, saint in one religion is also saint in the other religion, and that already promotes a tolerance, right? Through effective communication, you also can say that countries navigate cultural differences, because nowadays there are no homogeneous countries in the world. That means that a lot of times you do have the countries that expose and show and express different type of interactions. So for example, they do have 5 or 6 ethnic groups, and then you have countries that are relatively homogeneous. Of course, the pressure is bigger on multicultural countries because they need to accommodate a lot of different roots, a lot of different cultures in one. Therefore, of course, country leaders are expected to have particular level of cross-cultural competence. And we also say that there is of course, response of the challenge. That is a challenge for everyone. For instance, we could see in the recent war, right, ongoing in Ukraine, that a lot of European countries, regardless of the differences in their internal domestic, let's say, affairs, or regardless of the fact that they might not like each other that much themselves, they still united forces a little bit, right? So especially in the beginning, they united forces to answer to the aggression. So certain cause also can become, let's say, the moderator, or can become the trigger for increased cross-cultural competence. If we have common problem, COVID, for instance, is also a very good example, because in the times of COVID, when people started to talk about vaccination, every country tried to, of course, accommodate their population, but regardless, vaccination was everyone's interest, regardless of the culture, right? So regardless of where did you come from, we all wanted to get cured, and I think we all wanted pandemics to be over. So in that, we are also seeing the cross-cultural competence. So this all looks fantastic. We understand why should we learn cross-cultural communication, what's the deal there, why is it so important, etc., etc. But now I would like to touch upon the challenges and some of the troubles that come across when you start to attempt to raise your cross-cultural competence, right? So when we say that it's so important, you might have natural desire, okay, like my cross-cultural competencies are amazing. So how am I supposed to know if I am doing a good job or not, right? So there are common challenges that every individual meets, as well as culture, of course, meets on the way of accepting other in its roots, right? We say that culture often is understood as an iceberg, where you have this visible cultural expressions such as food, clothing, dance, art, and music on top of the iceberg that are more visible. And then deep underwater, you do have language and communication, verbal and non-verbal symbols. You have attitudes and norms. you have beliefs and values and relationships and roles. Okay, this sounds a little bit weird, right? So let's explain. For example, you might have a person in your surroundings who dresses as you, who listens to the same music, and who, I don't know, who is, liking the same food as you do. So it's almost the same. But then when you get closer to that person, right? So for example, I don't know, a person from Georgia, let's say Georgia, right? My country, I know my country the best. So let's say you have a Georgian friend and they dress as you, they eat the same as you, they love to dance, they love arts, they love music, they respect you for those things, right? And you respect them for those things. So the first problem arrives when it starts to affect language and communication, nonverbal, for example, communication, right? Nonverbal and verbal communication both of them are very important because, for instance, in verbal communication, we can say, in this case, your Georgian friend might say one word meaning 5 words, right? So for you, it will be a little bit different. You might not have laconic language, or you might have the same laconic language concept. So then it's covered. Non-verbal communication, a lot of times Georgians like to use body language. I don't know how is it in Cyprus if you use body language that much, but we like to wave hands, we like to shake head, we like to talk very expressively, a little bit like Italians, So it can be slightly too much for someone who is not used to our body language while talk. So you might feel that this person is a little bit too dramatic when they are communicating with me. Attitudes and norms. You might understand that even if Georgian friend of yours looks very modern, and even if they share the same food, clothing, dance, art, and music, their attitudes and their norms can be quite different from your own. So they might dramatize more simple situations, for example. For instance, they might tell you, you don't have to be on time. This is not so important. But actually being on time is what you value in your culture. So how do we navigate that? Because you will have this friend, from the other culture who is always late. Because for them, time is just fluid. They are like, okay, whatever. I'm just late. What can I do, right? But for you, if you are more, like German culture, they're very punctual, like Swedish culture, where I live right now, it's also very punctual, right? So if you are expected to be very punctual, and then in the culture, and you are late for some reason, and you are from fluid culture, so for you, it's like, okay, it's just the time, right? It's not that important. Then, of course, you will have a potential problem. There is a very famous strategy of talking about circular time expressions and linear timeline. Just one word there would be that the cultures which are circular in their timing, they have expressions in their languages such as kill time. So they often say, I want to kill time, so I have a lot of time. We do have it in Georgian. We always say, I have plenty of time, I don't know what to do, so I'm gonna go and play some solitaire or something. I will kill time. Whereas in the Western, like more linear aligned cultures, they often say time is money, so you don't have that much time to lose. So depending on which culture do you come from, of course there will be a problem, right? Because if you think that, okay, I have plenty of time, I can do whatever. And then there is one friend of yours who says like, no, there is not like that. You have to be on time. You have to do everything in minutes. So of course, such friendship of those two people will be a little bit problematic at some point when you are not always ready to put up with each other's shenanigans. Beliefs and values. For instance, if the value is different in terms of maybe religious value or maybe family value, family orientation, a lot of times there are cultures, for example, which like to make everything serious. Like, again, Georgians like, for instance, mostly, I wouldn't say that it's 100%, but mostly in the future, if you ask any gender, female or male, they will tell you that they would imagine themselves having family, having child, you know, after maybe 20 years, not today and tomorrow, but they would imagine that because we have a family orientation, family as a value in our culture. And if you look at Sweden, for example, right? In Sweden, you have a value which is individual. So you have a value which is self. And what do you need for your welfare? So more and more, recently I have listened to this Swedish TV program which said that more and more Swedish women make a choice of not giving birth because they don't want to have kids. And it's not because they can't, they don't want to. So this is a conscious choice, which for my culture, it would be impossible, almost impossible, because it should be family-oriented, you know, a family-oriented value that we have in Georgia. Whereas for Sweden, it's very individualistic. They don't believe that having a kid is so important in life. So you are important as an individual. Why do you want a child, you know? Is that to prove your importance, or is that because you want it? Like, what is the motivation? So their beliefs and values are different. So if you have a couple that meets, right? International couples are incredibly popular nowadays. So if you have a couple and you do have, for example, a woman who is family-oriented and a man who is Swede, and they don't want children, of course there will be a potential conflict, right? And such people most probably cannot become happy unless they go into consensus mode. The other famous example I can tell you about politics, for example, if you do have an electoral campaign, or if you have a leader of the country where this family orientation is very important, and they believe that family structure is very strong, it should be very strong in order to raise the strong society. And on the other hand, you have a totally liberal leader who really doesn't care because in his country or in her country, everything is different. Of course, those two will have the interest conflict. They will not look at the things in the same way. And that's a fact, I want to tell you. Relationships and roles. Of course, relationships and the roles that you take in the culture are very important. For example, it can be a little bit homogeneous concept of having a student in Georgia and student in Cyprus, or a professor in Georgia and professor in Cyprus. That's a role, right, that we take. However, again, relationships with the students, relationships with the colleagues, relationships with the environment are different. For instance, it can be, again, someone can be professor, but they might go to lunch with their students, right? Whereas in Georgia, if you are a professor, you don't really do that much because it's not really, I would not say accepted, it is accepted, but it's still a little bit off. You can go on lunch, you know, with your colleagues, but not with your students that much. It's not somehow not accepted as a norm yet, anyways, right? However, 20 years ago, there was also a time when drinking coffee at the lecture was almost a crime, right? Today, it's a little bit different. So today we are facing a more liberal world. So there can be particular switches in relationships and roles, but otherwise you have to know that just having the same title does not always mean the same from culture to culture. I would remember this directive leadership, for example, and political leadership, right? It's one of the best examples. So you look at the military leaders, right? And military leaders are very directed. That's their role, to be a military leader, army general. So they're very strong. They're giving orders, and people need to obey. Whereas in the civil life, ordinary, for example, organizational leader can just tell you about their idea, and you can say, no, we don't like this, right? But this will not happen in military. If you say to general, I don't like this, you will be dismissed from the position. So those are some of the challenges, but also we have here the list, of course, navigating language barriers, communication styles, cultural misconceptions in the global interactions, nonverbal communication, cultural norms, stereotypes and prejudice. We will say a couple of words here. So, cultural stereotype. I have a couple of Brazilian friends, acquaintances. And my first reaction, until I would gain my cross-cultural competence many years ago now, I was a little student back then, younger student, much young. So my first reaction when I met my good Brazilian friends nowadays was, but you must love football. And surprisingly, none of them watched football. And they were pretty much offended that I necessarily associated Brazil with only football of all the things in the world. So that is the same when you, for example, and it's a common, very funny thing that there are cultural stereotypes about different nationalities of the world, right? For example, we say that Jewish are very smart, and this is a common stereotype as well. Brazilians are good in football, or every Italian knows how to bake pizza, which is weird because that is not so, of course. No one checked it anyways. So cultural stereotypes are dangerous for cross-cultural relations because there was a time when Franz Boas, famous anthropologist, made his also very famous experiment of measuring the skull, because there was a common stereotype back then, which was connected to the racial stereotype, that certain race, I'm not going to, of course, dive in details, but certain races have smaller skull than the other race. And that is, of course, a dangerous cultural stereotype that might lead to more serious consequences. Most of the time, prejudices and cultural stereotypes are harmless, but sometimes they can get really dramatic. So we need to look out for that, right? I will tell you a very famous example from world politics, also international relations, if you wish, migration crisis, right? When the waves of migrants appeared in Europe, a lot of politicians had the attitude that migrants were a problem. And this is so interesting because it is exactly prejudice. They did not look at migrants as the people who need help. They looked at the migrants as a problem that needs to be solved, which is in itself, of course, the root of certain migrational politics that appears little by little in Europe. Power distance. Power distance can be also inside the community, not only outside, right? So, for instance, when a country which is very strong gets criticism of the country that is not so strong, would you expect a very strong country to accept the criticism? Most probably no. And it is connected to the power distance. Even the most liberal countries that do have ambition have also the trend of not listening to much criticism. You might also a little bit maybe feel this when you are talking to someone who is on the higher position, or talking to someone who is from older culture historically, and they always like trying to oh, but we are older, right? I remember my own case here. So when I spoke to my Swedish friends a couple of times, and I mentioned that, oh, but Georgia is much older than Sweden, so Georgian culture is much older. We have much, more sophisticated alphabet, writing systems, this, that. And one of my friends turned around, she is a Swede, and she told me, and so what? And I understood that that was a typical power distance prejudice, right, that I tried to impose. Power is not in being, power distance is assertion on being older, being wiser, being stronger, having more nuclear weapon, having more constant army, material resources. Oh, I'm a richer country, so I can tell you how to live, which is basically, of course, the root of the conflict in most of the cases. Perception of time, we spoke about it a little bit, that is circular and linear. And cultural sensitivity. Oh, I love this one. The first reaction when you receive a criticism. And I would say here, maybe it's a little bit risky one to talk about, but you know, cultural sensitivity is, there are certain cultures which are incredibly defensive when you start to give a feedback or when you start to say, how do you feel in the culture? Some people, some representatives from that culture might get incredibly defensive. They might be like, no, it is you. You don't understand it. You don't understand our culture correctly. So for instance, if you say that, oh, you know, it doesn't make me feel so comfortable when we go to the supermarket, I need to buy my own products and you need to buy your own products, even though we are girlfriend and boyfriend. And this person tells you, oh, this is so in my culture, right? And you say, yeah, but still, I'm a foreigner, but I don't feel comfortable about it. And they get defensive and they say, oh, but you don't understand anything, right? So this is a cultural sensitivity that some of the cultures exhibit. This is, for example, when you, you know, part of the population, when you ask them about European Union, right? And they say, no, we don't like it because they teach us how to live, because they didn't give us any, you know, any benefits, etc. So this is a little bit cultural sensitivity when culture is not ready to accept the feedback, positive or negative. I mean negative, of course, most of all. So they are not ready to see the improvement perspective, rather than they go in the defensive mode, right? Oh, this is you who is the problem. This is you who doesn't understand. So there are cases, of course, when the cross-cultural communication can be positive or can be very successful. And there are the cases when it can be incredibly unsuccessful. So successful cases, of course, they are facilitating and understanding cooperation. They are developing mutual respect among diverse cultures in international engagements. That's very, very simple. But, you know, there are sometimes unsuccessful cases. So today we will, you know, in the rest of the time, we will try to talk about both examples of success as well as examples of failure, so that you will understand a little bit maybe better how it works. So I have chosen two cases. The first case is the case of success. That is a Georgian-Russian war, August 2008. For those who don't know, so the war between Russia and Georgia started in 2008, August 5. And then in August 8, everything went a little bit, you know, dramatic. And we were on the verge, of course, of having the very big problem of losing their independence and losing the land, etc. By the way, for the information, 20% of Georgian territory is still occupied by Russian forces today. So those are, you know, so that was a moment when there was a Medvedev who was the president back then, and Putin was the prime minister in 2008, and we did have a very big trouble. So we did have a trouble of, you know, Russian army standing very close to Georgian capital city, Tbilisi, and so we didn't know exactly what to do, I would assume. So it was a very risky situation. In the meantime, as a smaller country, as the country in need of help, there was EU, which started to react. Nicolas Sarkozy was the person who brokered the peace ceasefire agreement that was signed first by Georgian president and then by Russian president Medvedev. I'm sorry, I apologize for that. So the ceasefire agreement was signed on August 12th, which marks the official, let's say, ending of the fire on both sides. Even if, you know, we still struggle with the Russia's 6 points, so 12-point agreement was signed by both sides and Georgians fulfilled their 6, whereas we are still waiting for Russians to fulfill their portion for this time. Still, it was a success case because Nicolas Sarkozy was the one who, you know, became a middleman between two cultures that were in the conflict, or two countries that were in the conflict. None of the countries, let's say Georgians, did not receive exactly what they wanted, of course, except they lost the territories. Of course, we lost the territory, so it was not exactly our dream scenario. But at the same time, we kept the independence, right? And for Russians, of course, maybe they did not want us to keep the independence, but at the same time, they took our territories. So those were, that was a lose-lose agreement, I would suppose. Like, none of the sides were perfectly happy. But that was the diplomacy of Nicolas Sarkozy, who managed to use this conflict situation in order to regulate the sides very delicately. So that was actually a very high-class diplomacy in action, and of course cross-cultural communication, because he communicated first with Georgian president, and then he flew to Moscow to communicate with the Russian president. So, and he achieved success in both cases, right? So we signed it, and they signed it. Of course, it doesn't mean that, at the end of the day, it's still debatable whether the agreement was formed or no. But it's a very interesting example because it shows you that diplomacy and knowing how to communicate correctly with different cultures can actually solve very acute conflicts. Because, it happened in the situation when Georgians didn't have a hope that we would not end up in the total war against Russians, as well as Russians had a hope of completely conquering Georgia. So that was one of the cases that was extremely successful for cross-cultural communication purposes. About the cases of failure, well, they are actually available in abundance. So let's say if you start to search for the failure cases of, cases of failed cross-cultural communication, you will get a lot of results. But I would like to speak more about the two cases, I would say. And so first one is Japanese mokusatsu, which if you don't understand, when you go to Japan, that there is silence, culture of silence, or culture of being silent, which is called mokusatsu, then you might have a very serious problem in negotiating with any Japanese partner, business partner, political partner, diplomat, etc. So mokusatsu as a word means killing silence. So kill and silence. So it is a concept of having business negotiations where the Japanese businessman is listening to you very carefully without donning any word. So can you imagine how creepy would that be if you enter in the room of negotiations, you try to communicate with the people, you talk, you show the presentation, you think that you are the best, you think that you're doing a good job, but then the person who needs to make a final decision is silent all the time. That is a very peculiar phenomenon. So if you don't know about this and you expect the person to react on your speech or on your presentation, etc., but you encounter Japanese mokusatsu and you don't know that this is a silent culture of silence in business negotiation, then you might probably will end up not having a deal that you want to have. So Japanese logic is based on the fact, of course, based on their writings. I'm saying no, it's not a theory of mine, but rather their own writers, who assume that the silence culture is important from the religious dimension, that silence is gold. It is golden. Therefore, every word of the very important person holds significant value. So, for instance, there would be a difference between what ordinary man speaks and what an emperor speaks, because there is a power balance, of course, and there is a power game. Emperor is much powerful than ordinary fisherman, for instance. So if fisherman says, let's say, 15 words and emperor says 5, those 5 words will be more valuable at the end of the day. So this is approximately the logic between Japanese mokusatsu. The less you say, the more valuable you are in the game. Therefore, if Japanese, during the negotiations with Europeans or with other Eastern cultures or Southern cultures who are very, emotional, they decide to, talk a lot, and Japanese are quiet. This can lead to, of course, very big failed communication between those two. And there is a case of Western corporation a very famous one that tried to gain favors in Japan, but they couldn't because they did not understand why were people mostly silent when they spoke to them. And of course, they started to have problems with the self-confidence, self-doubt started to appear, which of course naturally led to destroyal of business negotiations. Another case of failure, which is eminently connected to politics, it is the 2008 case, which is pretty interesting because when you read about this case, you will understand that it's not only cultural reason that of course failed it, it's more so political reason, but it is very interesting cross-cultural communication attempt, right? So the story goes that in 2008, the minister from Switzerland has visited Tehran, Iran. And I would like to also show you the video, which has no sound and it's not needed, but I just want you to have the opportunity to look at this wonderful moment, because so the whole problem appeared, and of course the problem appeared based on the fact that the Western, very much Western leaders, such as the minister from Switzerland, appeared in Iran, and she decided to cover her hair. And moreover, there was one significant detail about her behavior that I would like to point out. So hopefully we will see. Should I start it? Okay. Yeah, I think you see it, right? Yeah. So as you see, the minister visits Ahmadinejad, and there was a handshake, and there was like very beautiful exchange of information. So the idea was that Switzerland wanted to have alternative routes to oil and gas, of course, and they were considering Iran as a partner. But like if to the environment where she tries to appeal basically to Iranian leader, right? So she covered her hair even though she is a Western community representative. And one of the very famous problems arose when she decided to sit right below the picture of Ayatollah Khomeini, which is right here. So if you see that episode, and if you just look at the picture that is above her in that video, you will see that that is Ahmadinejad is sitting like, and there was above him, there was a map, rather than where minister sits above her is Ayatollah Khomeini, who was behind the Islamic Revolution of Iran. Of course, his course is completely unacceptable for the people in Europe, and it is not shared. None of his ideas and none of Iran's politics are shared in the Western world. Therefore, it was quite surprising that the Western leader and her immediate environment did not control, let's say her representatives did not control the environment where the minister was going to sit. I would not say that this was exactly the reason why the negotiations were not held, but I will tell you this, that there was a conflict, and in Western press, a lot of like newspapers wrote about behavior of Western minister who decided to, play good girl in order to get the oil deal done, which it did not fulfill itself. So the negotiations were failed. Again, the reason might be purely political, so it might have nothing to do with the cultural dimension. However, I would say that she underwent quite a big pressure from the Western society because of her attire, because of the fact that she closed her basically hair, and she tried to behave as ordinary woman would do in that situation, whereas she was the representative of the Western country, so she was not expected to behave as the others would, expect her to. And strategies for effective cross-cultural communication. So, right, there are more examples, of course, of failure that I would like to show you, but let's go through PPT first until the end. And if we have some minute or two left, then I will show you this like very good video of the exchange between Angela Merkel and Recep Tayyip Erdogan, which is absolutely fantastic example of how sometimes cross-cultural communication fails miserably. And so strategies for effective cross-cultural communication. So how to avoid any type of misunderstanding, how to avoid any type of the problem that might arrive when we try to communicate with the other countries' representatives, right? First is the cultural awareness. Get the information before you start to enter the other culture. That's very important, right? Second is active listening. So when the person tells you that something is unacceptable in their culture, you need to believe that, and you need to, try to engage with that information actively rather than just, accept it passively. Respect and sensitivity. You have to respect and be sensitive towards what other people say, but also towards your own culture. You have to be respectful and not to think that, okay, like other cultures are better than mine or something similar. Adaptability. You have to be flexible enough to understand that, for instance, this is called the independence level on cultural shock scale. It is stage number 4. When you understand that you still have a job to do, so you need to behave as that country wants you to behave outside, but then inside your apartment, you are still your own sort of a person. I would give you a typical example here. That would be Turkish quarters in Germany, Turkish districts in Germany, right? So outside they work as ordinary, like Germans require. So there is like typical westernized, let's say, look and everything. But then at home, they still keep their own traditions and they still keep their own values. So that is adaptability. When outside you behave the way the cultures want, the host cultures want you to behave, and inside you're still your own of a person. Clear and simple language. If you're not sure if the person understands you correctly or no, then use clear and simple language. Give very straightforward messages. Don't start to insinuate, don't start to use idioms that people don't know, they might not know. Therefore, being clear and simple is a solution. Nonverbal communication. You can use nonverbal communication in order to clarify a lot of things. Other than that, you have to, of course, be careful that and make sure that the others interpret your gesticulation the way you interpret them. Build trust and seek feedback. That's, I think, seeking feedback is the simplest of all, because you can always ask if people understand the things the way you want them to understand. And of course, some of the people, those who are in diplomacy, they also have cultural competency training, which is additional, of course, too. We do have technologies, and technologies affect on cross-cultural communications. So you do have global communication platforms like TikTok, for example, Instagram, Telegram, WhatsApp, etc. Right? For language, we often use language tools such as Google Translate or ChatGPT, etc. But again, the problem is that often the language translations are not accurate because we might use in everyday speech some of the idioms, and they cannot be understood by the people who speak different language. Virtual collaboration tools like your learning platform, for example, where you have this collaboration with others through platform. Cross-cultural training and education, like this course, for example, that raises your awareness a little bit. Global marketing and outreach, and online cross-cultural communities. Maybe some of you are members of those communities or international organizations, right? That help you to raise your cultural competence. And then we have impact on global security and stability. So as we said, cross-cultural communications can actually help to establish diplomacy and effective diplomacy. And we saw the example of Georgia, for instance. It can contribute into the global security. Otherwise, you can say that what are the tools, what are the ways in which cross-cultural communication can be helpful? That can be impact by promoting understanding and respect, of course, facilitating dialogue as well as mediation, which we saw in the case of Georgia and Nicolas Sarkozy and France, helping Georgia in the times of the war, addressing root cause of conflict, of course, conflict resolution and reconciliation work, promoting inclusive decision-making inside the states or the conflicting states, and preventing miscommunication and misinterpretation between the states, of course. And here you will see a further reading, which is the end of my PPT, exactly on time. I still have 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and I really want to show you that video, which I was talking about, of the failed case, because I think that's a very interesting one, and I really want you to dive in as well. So further reading is for your attention. So if you feel that you want to, study a little bit more, or you're interested in references from where does this text come from, or you're interested in more details, then of course you can dive in and read that. Now let me check if this thing will work, and let's try to share. Okay. No, it's still. Oh, no. There. Mother. Let's start again.
Turkey's President Erdogan has given Angela Merkel a scolding at a meeting in Ankara after she used the term Islamist when talking about the fight against terror.
We talked extensively about fighting Islamist terror and agreed that we want to collaborate closely.
Bakın İslamist terör ifadesi.
Look, the term Islamist terror seriously upsets us Muslims. That term should not be used. It's not right. Because Islam and terror cannot come together. As a Muslim president, I can never accept such terminology.
The Chancellor later explained that her words will not imply any suspicion regarding Muslims. The tone of the meeting, though, was chilly throughout. In fact, the other locals of the two hardly at any point saw eye to eye.
Biz bunun karşısında durmak durumundayız.
Right, so that's approximately the situation. Tell me that you hate me without telling me that you hate me. Right, so this is approximately what we are talking about when we discuss the failure of the cross-cultural communication and how certain things cannot go our way. So this is the typical example. That is Angela Merkel's visit of the failure. So that is why I'm returning the cases of failure here. And that is Angela Merkel's visit to Recep Tayyip Erdogan in 2017. And as you saw, this is a CNN video, and that caused a massive uproar because there was a failed body language between them. And of course, it shows that even if Erdogan just made a very clear assessment of Angela Merkel's words about Islamic terror, he still decided to almost punish her by not looking at her, by not having an eye contact, which is a very important tool for diplomats, right? And so are multiple cases that you can look for yourselves. But if you join us, of course, tomorrow as well and the rest of the days, we will be talking and discussing about some of the strategies, talking about communication and nonverbal communication and some of the other elements as well. So this was it for today. And if you have any questions, then I think I am ready to read it in the chat or right. Yeah, so if you have any questions, I am ready.
Thank you so much, Nino, for this highly stimulating lecture. And of course, I will say this also in Greek. Μπορείτε να θέσετε τα ερωτήματά σας μέσω του παραθύρου του chat, να γράψετε τυχόν σχόλια και ερωτήσεις. It was a really interesting lecture addressing issues related not only to distant cultures, but also to less distant cultures. For example, inside Europe, sometimes we have similar complications in intercultural communication. A question that I would like to set is regarding the very classification of human groups into cultures. One might say that there is an underlying assumption, underlying culturalist assumption, that human groups can indeed be classified and differentiated into distinct cultures. Personally, I agree that this differentiation is valid, but I would like to hear also your view on this.
Yeah, well, that is definitely a valid point to my mind. Of course, I'm not the one who can know all truth, but in my opinion as well, it is possible to differentiate different cultures, and diversity of the people's traditions, their mindset, their life generally creates different cultural groups. It's interesting to talk about maybe what is culture in itself, because there are more than 356 definitions of culture. So, for example, ancient Greeks have a definition that culture is the second nature, or culture is everything that is not nature, which makes it a very vague concept. So if we take the attitude that culture is basically the mindset or the framework or so-called metrics in which we live, then definitely we can differentiate multiple cultures. That is possibility. Not always the cultural borders coincide with the borders of the country. And that is also something that needs to be differentiated, because often people believe that country and culture are the same, but actually that is not so, because inside one state or inside the borders, geographical borders of the country, you might have multiple different cultures coexisting. So definitely.
So cultural borders are not to be always easily equated with either territorial or linguistic or ethnic or national borders. There are many overlappings and many complex relationships between all these terms.
Definitely. Definitely. And that is why we do have attempts in world history to create artificial cultures that extend beyond one country, beyond one ethnic element, beyond one language, etc. For example, Hellenism, Alexander the Great, right? So, or for example, Soviet Union later on, quasi-cultures, or the cultures that are artificial and they try to consume everything. So, yeah, that can be also.
It's a highly interesting issue, and I will repeat my suggestion, my encouragement to you to set questions or write your comments, your objections, anything that you would like to share with us and with our speaker tonight. It's a good time to repeat that Nino will give another 3 lectures. The second, tomorrow, Thursday, will be the second lecture that will be given within the framework of our program of PNYK's Political History, Theory and Practice, tomorrow, Thursday, on 6 p.m. I don't see any questions at the moment.
They want to rest. They don't want to have any questions.
But I'm sure you watched this lecture with great interest, because it was a really fascinating topic, and we will be really happy to hear also Nino's tomorrow's lecture within the framework of our program. So I think it's time to thank Nino for this great lecture, and see you all tomorrow in our second lecture.
Thank you guys for coming, and I'll see you tomorrow, hopefully.
Bye-bye.
Bye.